Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey there, Herman and Corn. So I'm a big believer in the aphorism, never let a good crisis go to waste. I'm not sure this is what was intended by that expression, but I've always taken it to mean that if you have a crisis in your life, as much as it is a stressful period, it can be an opportunity for growth. In fact, when I typed that saying into Google, the first thing I got was a link from the Stoicism subreddit, which is interesting because a very dear friend of mine who I haven't been in contact with in many years. I guess when you move country, sadly, sometimes you just drift out of contact with old friends who you're not geographically linked to anymore. But his name is Peter Duffy. He's a fantastic guy, one of the smartest people that I know and have known. And he bought me once a book about Stoicism. I guess he saw in Stoicism something that might be helpful for me. I'm always a bit hesitant to look into philosophies because I'm Jewish, as you know, and I don't want to change my religion. But that came up anyway, and maybe it's a sign that I want to look more into that. But what I want to talk about in the never let a good crisis go to waste idea is, I mentioned recently that my wife and I had a pretty horrible situation. I feel like we both feel like we're kind of battered emotionally, physically from the experience. We had a leak in our roof, which shouldn't have been that significant of a problem or a setback. And there was a rainstorm and it started dripping, but our landlord refused to do anything about it. And then got very nasty and refused to allow us to do anything ourselves. So it just got worse and worse because he wasn't remediating it, blaming the neighbors. They couldn't fix it. It rained again. And it just became this like saga. It started spreading across the room. I have asthma, so mold started forming. I started getting like asthma attacks. And then when our landlord finally visited and said he would fix it, the next day he wrote us an email basically contradicting everything he said, saying, it's not my problem. I have nothing to do with it. And then finally said, I'm not going to correspond with you. I'm not going to speak about this anymore. So left us in a really, really awkward situation. After weeks sleeping on the ground, we relocated to a relative's place that was available to us for 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on when he came. And when you haven't slept in a bed for a week and you've got a 6-month-old child, and even one night, you can't overstate how helpful that is, even if it's just kind of recuperating a little bit and getting the energy to kind of pick up where you left off. Because for 2 weeks, if not 3, my whole life became researching the law, writing formal demands to our landlord, making sure that they were certified in the post, everything. There was no time to do anything else. And between moving back and forth with 2 places and a 6-month-old who was stressed and it genuinely felt like I was in a nightmare. So we were terrified that we would have no place to stay, literally. Our landlord didn't offer to put us up in alternative accommodation, rent reduction, nothing. His words were something to the effect of, if you can disconnect from the room psychologically, you can continue living here. If not, you have to leave. And it was very weird. We were standing there with him and the repair person, and they were kind of just saying, they're looking at it purely as a leak, as a water intrusion issue. And we had to like say, but where are we going to sleep? It didn't seem to occur to anyone that when this happens in the only bedroom in an apartment, you've nowhere to sleep. And the other thing we heard so much was, oh, just leave. You can just leave, as if it's not a nightmare to find a new apartment, which it is. Maybe nightmare is a bit strong, but it's a really expensive, really exhausting, really draining process. Did I say expensive? And it ends up just costing you a load of money. So even that wasn't like an easy option. Telling a tenant that you can just leave isn't really helpful if they've nowhere else to go and they have to handle moving. So it felt like there was just this colossal gap between the reality. I mean, and as I have to say, I was terrified as a father and as an asthmatic. I was scared that I was going to be forced to sleep in the room again, which I did, and that made my asthma worse. So I'm back to sleeping on the couch. So it's a really challenging time, to be totally honest. And what's been hard about it? This has been physically hard, yes. What's also been hard, maybe even harder for me to come to grips with, and maybe this is something I need to chat over in therapy. Not that I'm in therapy, but maybe I should go to talk about this. It's, to me, I'm really disappointed by the callousness of any human that could see a young family with, literally an unsafe bedroom. There was holes in the concrete as well, and just say, basically, go out on the street, you're on your own. So there's that aspect to me that really just kind of, I would say, breaks my faith in humanity a bit. And I know that's totally unreasonable. It's one data point among many other good humans, but when you hear that from a lot of people, it begins to feel like a lost cause. The other thing that's been really hard about this incident, the second thing I would say, besides feeling that this is a just horrible system, because as I mentioned in previous episodes, it's not the first rental disaster that I've had here. I was trying every possible direction, because our landlord said he wouldn't speak to us and became very nasty and unreasonable very quickly. I began trying to reach out to any government office who I thought could offer us help, whether that was in the form of free legal aid or a tenants' right organization, or even just a municipal helpline. When you say the days are counting down until we have this place, and then after that we have no clear idea what to do besides sleep on the ground, and that's really making us exhausted and unable to care for our 6-month-old son. So I tried everything. I tried the building department for saying that this is unsafe in its current condition. I tried legal clinics, as I mentioned, tenants' rights organization, the municipality, and it was just one big failure. Basically, the only person we got to listen was a lawyer who briefed us on our legal rights and was extremely helpful. It was also expensive, but she was great. The municipality, and she put her mind at ease as well, as I think lawyers sometimes get a hard time. But when you're in a crisis like this, just knowing what your rights are and getting answers is invaluable. So that was amazing. But the municipality, which I pay Arnona to every month, was a flat failure. I got told that this is a tenant's issue, isn't within our purview. And I said, hang on, I'm paying municipal dues on this apartment as a renter, and you're telling me that you can do nothing to help whatsoever. We got through to a rights organization at the municipality that told us that God should help us. And when my wife told him how hard moving was, the response was, "Oh, you're exaggerating how much it costs." So it compounded the horrible situation we were in. We were exhausted, sleep deprived, stressed, was greatly compounded by the feeling that when we used these channels that were supposedly there to help, we found that they were less than useless. So Herman and Corn, I'd like to chat about that today. We've talked in a number of episodes about the rental market, how broken it is, how poor tenancy law is in Israel. But this saga exposed to me another problem that we have, and that is a total lack of support for people in tenancy-related issues. I think if I was trying to figure out what the challenge was, I got through the social services and they said they called back, they never did. You get the laundry list. And I was thinking to my wife, what's the issue here? And I think a large part of it was it's not an emergency from their perspective, even though to you it's horrific. They can say, well, just sleep on the ground, find a new place. So you find you're in this kind of legal limbo land where you feel like it's bad enough that there should be some support, and in this case it wasn't. I'd love to ask Herman and Corn. I give the Jerusalem municipality a 1-star review for their response in this case, but you know that a big part of what we do on this podcast is try to take these sometimes challenging experiences and provide hope. What might a better city have done, and give me some examples of municipalities, local governments that have stepped up a bit to really help people who are caught in these really, really horrible situations regarding tenancy. Herman and Corn, over to you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother.
Herman Poppleberry here and ready to dive in. Although, I have to say, the prompt we are looking at today hits a little close to home.
It really does. Our housemate Daniel sent this one in, and for those who do not know, we all live together in Jerusalem. Daniel and his wife actually just went through this absolute nightmare of a situation with a massive roof leak, and a landlord who, frankly, sounds like he graduated from the School of Villainy.
It was heartbreaking to watch. They have a 6-month-old baby, and they are dealing with mold, respiratory issues, and a landlord telling them to just psychologically disconnect from the fact that their ceiling is dripping. I mean, the callousness is staggering.
It really highlights that aphorism Daniel mentioned, never let a good crisis go to waste. But in this case, the crisis exposed a massive gaping hole in the local social safety net. Daniel tried reaching out to every municipal office he could find, and he basically got a shrug and a good luck.
Right, and that is what we are going to tackle today. Not just the specifics of Daniel's situation, but the broader question: what does a city that actually cares about its tenants look like? How do other municipalities around the world handle these kinds of housing emergencies? Because it turns out, it does not have to be this way.
Exactly. We have talked before about how the rental market in Israel can feel like the Wild West. We actually have the 1972 Tenants Protection Law, as amended, including reforms in 2017, but as Daniel found out, it is essentially toothless because it lacks an enforcement body. Today we want to look at the sheriffs. Who is actually doing this right?
It is a fascinating area of urban policy because it touches on everything from public health to legal rights to basic human dignity. So, let's get into it.
Let's start with the immediate crisis response. In Daniel's case, the roof is leaking, mold is forming, and the landlord is refusing to act. In Jerusalem, that is seen as a private civil matter. You have to sue, which takes months. But in a more proactive city, this would be treated as a code violation, or even a public health emergency.
Precisely. Take a look at a city like New York City. Now, New York is far from perfect, but they have a very robust Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or the HPD. If a tenant in New York City has a major leak or a lack of heat and the landlord refuses to fix it, the tenant can call 311.
And 311 is their general city services line, right?
Right. But what happens next is the key. The HPD sends out an inspector. If they find a hazardous condition, like a major leak or mold, they issue a violation. If the landlord still refuses to fix it within a very short time frame, the city can actually step in under their Emergency Repair Program, or ERP.
Wait, so the city actually hires the contractors to fix the roof?
Yes. They send in their own crews, fix the immediate problem to make the home habitable, and then they bill the landlord. And here is the kicker. If the landlord does not pay the city back, the city places a tax lien on the property. It is incredibly effective because it bypasses the landlord's stubbornness and prioritizes the safety of the residents. NYC's HPD invests millions annually in these emergency repairs just to keep people safe.
That is such a logical bridge. It moves the problem from a two-party dispute to a matter of municipal standards. I imagine that also takes the pressure off the tenant to be the one constantly fighting.
It changes the power dynamic entirely. Instead of the tenant begging the landlord is now answering to the city government, which has the power to effectively seize their property's equity if they do not comply.
But what about the situation where the apartment is truly uninhabitable? Daniel and his wife had to move out. They were essentially displaced by their own home. Does any city provide actual emergency housing for renters in that specific scenario?
That is where it gets a bit more complicated, but there are models. In some European cities, particularly in Germany and Scandinavia, there is a much stronger concept of the right to housing. In Berlin, for example, the local district offices, known as the Bezirksamt, have departments specifically for preventing homelessness, or the Fachstelle für Wohnungsnotfälle.
And they would categorize a family with a 6-month-old and a moldy roof as being at risk of homelessness.
Exactly. It is not just for people already on the street. If you are being forced out of your home due to a structural failure, you can apply for emergency assistance. They might provide temporary housing in a municipal hostel or a social apartment while the legal battle with the landlord plays out. They view it as a public health obligation.
That sounds like exactly the kind of safety net Daniel was looking for. Here in Jerusalem, he was told it was not an emergency because they technically had a roof, even if it was leaking and dangerous. It is like the definition of emergency is tuned only to the most extreme, absolute catastrophes, rather than the reality of a family's life being upended.
And that is a huge part of the problem. It is a failure of imagination on the part of the local government. They see themselves as providers of trash collection and street lighting, but not as the ultimate guarantors of habitability.
I want to go back to the idea of legal support. Daniel mentioned that the only person who helped was a lawyer, but that lawyer was expensive. For a lot of people, that cost is a barrier that makes the law effectively non-existent for them.
This is another area where some cities are really stepping up. New York City, again, was a pioneer here with their universal right to counsel law, passed in 2017 and expanded since.
I remember reading about that. It basically guarantees a lawyer to low-income tenants facing eviction, right?
Yes, and they have been expanding it. The data shows that when tenants have legal representation, they are significantly more likely to stay in their homes or reach a fair settlement. But beyond just eviction, some municipalities fund tenant advocacy groups that provide free legal clinics for exactly the kind of habitability issues Daniel faced.
Like a city-funded legal aid specifically for housing?
Exactly. In San Francisco, they have the Tenant Council, which receives city funding to help renters navigate the complex rent board system. If your landlord is harassing you or refusing repairs, you have a professional advocate in your corner from day one at no cost to you.
That seems like a relatively low-cost intervention for a city that could save so much in the long run by preventing displacement. If Daniel had been able to walk into a municipal office and get a lawyer to send a formal demand letter on city letterhead that same day, that landlord might have changed his tune very quickly.
Oh, absolutely. Landlords like the one Daniel dealt with thrive on the power imbalance. They know the tenant is tired, stressed, and probably does not have 5,000 shekels sitting around for a legal retainer. Once the city gets involved, that imbalance shifts.
Let's talk about a city that is often cited as the gold standard for housing, Vienna. I know they have a huge amount of social housing, but how does their system handle these kinds of crises for people who are in the private market?
Vienna is fascinating because about 60% of the population lives in some form of subsidized or municipal housing, known as Gemeindebau. This creates a massive downward pressure on the private market. But for those in private rentals, they have something called the Mieterhilfe.
The Mieterhilfe?
It translates roughly to tenant assistance. It is a service provided by the city of Vienna that offers free legal advice, mediation, and support for all residents. They have a massive database of what fair rents should be, what landlords are required to fix, and how to handle disputes.
So it is like a one-stop shop for any housing problem?
Exactly, and because so much of the city is municipal housing, the city has a massive amount of expertise in-house. They know how to fix a roof, they know how to remediate mold, and they have the legal team to enforce those standards across the whole city. It is not just a department, it is a philosophy that housing is a public utility, not just a speculative asset.
I love that phrase, housing as a public utility. It feels like in many places, including here, housing is seen primarily as a financial instrument for the owner, and the fact that people live in it is almost a secondary annoying detail.
That is exactly the shift we are seeing in cities like Barcelona as well. Under their recent housing policies, they have been very aggressive about the right to the city. They have laws that allow the city to temporarily seize apartments that have been left empty for years and turn them into social housing.
That is a bold move. How does that translate to the emergency repair side of things?
It creates an atmosphere where the landlord knows the city is watching. In Barcelona, if a building is falling into disrepair, the city can declare it a breach of the social function of property. They can fine the landlord up to hundreds of thousands of euros, or even take over the management of the building to perform necessary repairs.
It sounds like these cities have moved past the idea that a lease is just a private contract between two individuals. They recognize that if a building is unsafe, it affects the whole community. It affects the health of that 6-month-old baby, which eventually affects the public health system. It affects the stability of the neighborhood.
That is the second-order effect that often gets ignored. When a family is forced out of their home, they might lose their job due to the stress. Their children's education is disrupted. Their mental health suffers. The cost to the city of ignoring a roof leak is actually much higher than the cost of fixing it.
So if we were designing a supportive city from scratch, what would be the first 3 things on our list for tenant protection?
Number 1 would definitely be a proactive inspection and emergency repair program. The city needs to have the power to fix dangerous issues and bill the landlord. No more waiting for a court date while the mold grows.
I agree. Number 2 for me would be that one-stop shop for legal and social support. A place where Daniel could have gone on day 1 and talked to a human being who could offer a lawyer, a mediator, or even just a clear roadmap of his rights.
And number 3, I would say, is a robust emergency housing fund. Not just for victims of fires or natural disasters, but for victims of landlord neglect. If your home becomes uninhabitable through no fault of your own, the city should have a pool of apartments or vouchers to ensure you are not sleeping on a relative's floor for weeks on end.
It is interesting that all of these things exist in different parts of the world. It is not like we are dreaming up some impossible utopia. These are proven policies in places like New York, Berlin, and Vienna.
Precisely. It is a matter of political will and how a city chooses to define its responsibilities. If a city can find the budget to build a new stadium or a massive highway interchange, it can find the budget to ensure its residents are not being poisoned by mold.
You know, what struck me in Daniel's prompt was the mention of the municipal employee who told him he was exaggerating the cost of moving. That kind of gaslighting from a public servant is just the icing on the cake.
It is a symptom of a system that has completely lost touch with the reality of its citizens' lives. To that employee, it was just another file on a desk. To Daniel, it was the safety and stability of his family. That empathy gap is where the safety net falls apart.
It also points to a need for better training and a different culture within these municipal departments. They should see themselves as advocates for the residents, not as gatekeepers whose job is to say no to as many people as possible.
There is a great example of this from the city of Zurich. They have a specialized department for housing that focuses on mediation. They actually bring landlords and tenants together in a room with a neutral city official to work through these issues before they escalate to a crisis.
That sounds much more civilized than an aggressive email exchange.
It is, and the success rate is incredibly high. Most landlords do not actually want their buildings to fall apart. They are often just overwhelmed, cheap, or poorly informed about their obligations. A city mediator can explain the long-term financial benefits of fixing a leak now versus dealing with a structural failure later.
But what about the landlords who are just genuinely malicious, like the one who told Daniel to just disconnect psychologically?
For those, you need the hammer. You need the fines, the tax liens, and the public shaming. Some cities actually publish a list of the worst landlords. New York City's public advocate does this every year. It is a list of the landlords with the most open violations.
Does it actually work, or do they just see it as a badge of honor?
It works because it affects their ability to get financing. Banks do not want to lend to people on the worst landlords list. It affects their reputation in the community. It gives tenant organizers a clear target for their advocacy. It is about transparency.
I think there is also a conversation to be had about the stigma of renting. In many places, there is an underlying assumption that if you are renting, you are just in a transition phase to homeownership, so your rights are less important.
That is a huge factor, especially in countries like Israel or the United States, where homeownership is so culturally idealized. But in places like Switzerland or Germany, renting is a lifelong choice for millions of people across all income levels. When renting is the norm, the laws naturally become more protective.
So part of the solution is just recognizing that renting is a permanent and vital part of the housing ecosystem, and it needs to be treated with the same level of legal and social respect as owning.
Exactly. A home is a home regardless of who holds the deed. The physical safety and stability of the person living inside should be the primary concern of the law.
Let's talk about the crisis to opportunity angle. If Daniel's situation is the crisis, how could a city like Jerusalem use this to build something better?
Well, they could start by creating a tenants' rights task force. They could look at the data of how many people are calling with these issues and where the gaps in the current law are. They could pilot an emergency repair program in one neighborhood.
They could also create a more streamlined way to report these issues. Imagine an app where you can upload photos of a leak and a mold report, and it automatically triggers a municipal inspection.
That would be revolutionary. It would create a digital paper trail that the landlord couldn't ignore, and it would give the city real-time data on the health of its housing stock.
It feels like we are in a moment where the technology exists to make this so much easier, but the policy is still stuck in the 19th century.
It really is. We have the tools to track every delivery truck and every transit bus in real time, but we can't seem to track whether a family has a functioning roof over their heads.
I want to touch on something Daniel mentioned about his asthma. This isn't just a property dispute, it's a health crisis. The connection between housing quality and public health outcomes is so well documented.
Oh, the research is overwhelming. Substandard housing is a major driver of asthma, lead poisoning, and mental health issues. UK studies estimate that poor housing costs the National Health Service billions of pounds every year.
That's staggering.
It's massive. So when a city official says this isn't our problem, they are ignoring the fact that it will eventually become the problem of the healthcare system, the social services system, and the economy as a whole. Investing in housing quality is literally one of the most cost-effective things a city can do for public health.
It's the ultimate example of being penny wise and pound foolish. You save a few thousand shekels by not having an inspector, but you spend hundreds of thousands later on emergency room visits and lost productivity.
Exactly. And that doesn't even account for the human suffering, which should be reason enough to act.
So, for our listeners who might be in a similar situation to Daniel, or who want to advocate for change in their own cities, what are the practical takeaways here?
First, document everything. Photos, videos, emails, text messages. In a legal or municipal fight, paper is your best friend. Second, look for local tenant unions or advocacy groups. Even if the city doesn't have an official department, there are often grassroots organizations that can offer advice and solidarity.
And third, don't be afraid to make noise. Call your local representatives, go to city council meetings, talk to the press if the situation is extreme. Sometimes, the only way to get a bureaucracy to move is to make the cost of ignoring you higher than the cost of helping you.
And for those who are not in a crisis, use your vote. Ask candidates for local office what their specific plans are for tenant protections. Do they support a right to counsel? Do they support an emergency repair program? These are the issues that actually shape the quality of life in a city.
It really comes down to the idea that we are all responsible for the health of our communities. A city where one family is being forced onto the street because of a leaky roof is a city that is failing all of its residents.
I couldn't agree more. And I think Daniel's story, as painful as it has been, serves as a powerful call to action. We need to stop letting these crises go to waste and start demanding better from our local governments.
Well, Herman, I think we have covered a lot of ground today. From the HPD in New York to the Mieterhilfe in Vienna, it's clear that there are better ways to do this.
It's a matter of looking at what works and having the courage to implement it. Jerusalem, and every city, has the potential to be a place where tenants feel supported and secure.
Before we wrap up, I want to say a huge thank you to Daniel for sharing such a personal and difficult story with us. It's not easy to talk about these things when you are still in the middle of the stress, but it's so important for people to hear.
Absolutely. We are lucky to have you as a housemate, Daniel, and we are glad you and your family are in a safer place now.
And to our listeners, if you have been through something similar, or if you live in a city that has a great system for tenant support, we want to hear about it. Go to myweirdprompts.com and use the contact form to tell us your story.
We are also on Spotify, so make sure to follow us there to get every new episode as soon as it drops.
And hey, if you have been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate a quick review on your podcast app. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join this community of curious explorers.
It really does. We love seeing your feedback and hearing how these topics resonate with you.
All right, that is all for today. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
We will see you next time.
Take care of yourselves and each other.
Bye for now.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.